Thank you. I'm excited for the summer to be outside and to hear some more, classic songs, but actually classic, like hundreds of years classic songs come to new life. My name is Pastor Cory, and I say that because if you're new with us today, you may not have met me before, but also you're joining a conversation today that has been 6 weeks long. So I've been leading us through, we've been teaching through a series of teachings we've called Theogenetics. So Theo being God and genetics having something to do with science. I don't know, it's beyond me. But the idea is that God, the fabric of God, the threads of God are in each of us. And that we believe, that we think that every human being is a gift from God to us, to humanity, to the world. And as we gather today, just thinking about our church, every human being is a gift to our church too. As we gather together, that we can find divinity in each of us and even discover in our own lives that the way that God has made us has some kind of purpose in the world, in his kingdom, and in the local church. And so we've been calling this series Theogenetics, and it's been centered on a passage of scripture in a book called Ephesians. Now, the book of Ephesians was an early letter to an actual church, a church gathered in a place called Ephesus. And it's believed that the church in Ephesus was likely the most diverse church that we have in the New Testament. And so this church is trying to figure out, how do we center Jesus? How do we listen to each other? How do we be a church with each other when we all come from really, really different backgrounds? I think this is a challenge for the church today, too, isn't it? This has been an ongoing challenge for the church throughout history. And so we're going to look, the central text for this series has been found in the book of Ephesians in chapter 4. Let me read this for us. He says, he is Jesus, he gave some apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some shepherds and teachers. His purpose was to equip God's people for the work of serving and building up the body of Christ until we all reach the unity of faith and knowledge of God's Son. God's goal is for us to become mature adults, to be fully grown, measured by the standard of the fullness of Christ. Now, one of the challenges that we've faced in this teaching series looking at this text is these words like apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers either don't have much meaning in our lives today or carry different meaning today than they did back then. And so throughout this series, we've taken a Sunday each week and we've focused on a different kind of person, a different kind of theogenetic that exists in this text. And today we're at the last one that is called teachers. Now, if you've been following kind of the vibes of the book, so if you were to go home today and read the book of Ephesians and read this letter, you'd catch on that the whole impetus of this book is looking at the person of Jesus and trying to understand how do we as a community live in the same DNA or the same purposes of Jesus himself. And so as you're moving through the storyline, you'd begin to pick up on that the author views Jesus as the high apostle. This idea, the apostle literally means like sent one who is sent into a new place or new grounds or new territories to a new culture, different ways of being. And the idea here is that in the core of God is this apostolic nature and sent Jesus, who was God, to be human among us. So Jesus is the example of the high apostle. And then Jesus becomes the example of the high prophet, that throughout the church's history, there had been all of these examples and heroes that were called prophets. Maybe most famously, you would think of someone like Moses, who was seen to be a prophet in Jewish history, who went and stood before the most powerful people in the world and said, listen, it's not right that you are enslaving these people, so I'm here to speak truth to the power and set my people free. So being a prophet is speaking truth to power that dishonors the heart of God. And throughout God's history, throughout Jewish history, there are all kinds of these prophets like Moses or Esther or Amos or Joel. You can read about them in the Old Testament. That Jesus then is propped up as the true evangelist. That this idea of evangelist is the one who shares good news. Jesus, throughout his teachings and his life, was known for being good news where there was the least amount of good news. So he was sharing good news with people who didn't typically get much good news. People who maybe the church at the time was not good news for them. People who maybe the government at that time was not good news for them. People that maybe the economic system of that time was not good news to them. And so Jesus was good news to people who received the least amount of good news. And then last week we talked about how Jesus is the good shepherd. This idea that good shepherds are willing to lay their life down on behalf of the sheep. The good shepherds during the day, during good times, during peace times, feed and care for the sheep, care for the people around them. But then also in a good shepherd is the ability to recognize when it's night and guard the sheep when times are dangerous or particularly difficult. Today, I want to talk about teacher, the good teacher, which again in the book of life, people reach out to him and called him teacher or rabbi. Now, this would have a deep ancient history that teachers had been around a really long time for God's people and actually helped God's people live in a lot of different contexts. You know, God's people in their earliest days were slaves in Egypt, if you read the story. And the way that they connected to their story, the way they were connected to Yahweh or to God was through their origin story. And so their teacher, their guide was their origin story. This was the filter on how they understood how must we live, how must we hang on to what it means for us to be Jewish. If we can understand our origin story, we can interpret our lives through our origin story. And then if God's people are eventually freed from slavery and are wandering the desert and eventually find some land for themselves, they begin to develop laws over that time that govern them as a people. How did they come up with those laws? Well, some teachers in their midst that understood the origin story began putting together laws for a society that would be in response to that origin story. So it was teachers actually that helped them navigate the transition of context. Eventually, God's people developed ways of worshiping God that honored their origin story and helped them become the kinds of people who could live into the laws that they created. And so they had these temples and these practices of worship. And there was these priests that played the roles of teacher to help God's people worship God and have a religion, have a religious practice that honored their origins and their laws. Are you following this? But then over time, God's people would find themselves occupied by other powers of the day. And again, questions would emerge. How do we live into our origin story? How do we continue to live into the histories of our law when we live in a land that now has a higher law that oppresses our ways of living? How do we continue to practice our worship patterns in places like the temple when our temple has been destroyed? How do we continue to live into these practices when there are powers and principalities that live among us that don't allow us to worship and live freely based on our past? This has been the role of teachers throughout God's history over and over and over again to say, this is a new day. We live in a new time, and we must find ways to honor our past but transcend into this moment. That we literally can't live like our ancestors in every way. But teachers help us not disconnect from that past, but honor it and transcend it into this moment. And so teachers throughout God's history have helped God's people wrestle with some really deep questions of ethics and morality. Because when the context changed, those conversations change too, don't they? Those of you that have studied ethics and morality, you know that the world changes and context changes, and we learn new things and we live in the new futures, and all of those things have to be renegotiated and re-understood in new times. And so when Jesus walked the earth, there was these emerging teachers that were called rabbis. Actually, Jesus was called a rabbi. This was a fairly new idea for God's people. The emergence of rabbis was happening during this time, and there was some popular rabbis of the day that were wrestling with ethics and morality in this time while God's people were under Roman rule. And Jesus comes along, and people begin to refer to him as teacher or rabbi, because he too wrestled with difficult questions of ethics and morality and how we might live at this time with these people in this place. One of the great examples of this, and probably the lowest hanging fruit in the scriptures we have of this, can be found in Matthew chapter 22. In Matthew chapter 22, Jesus is approached by some people with this question: Teacher or Rabbi, what is the greatest commandment in the law? Now, what they're not asking is saying, Jesus, can you rank all of the law from the most important to the least important? What they're asking is more of a central conversation, like how do we interpret the law? I mean, this is what God's people are interested in, is how do we interpret our past in our present situation? So what interpretive tool do we have to understand everything else? You understand this question? Okay. So saying, Jesus, teacher, rabbi, what is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus replies, quoting one of the central practices of Jewish people at this time called the Shema. He quotes the Shema, this prayer that Jewish people prayed every single day. He replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, and all your mind. He says, this is the first and greatest commandment. Can you hear how Jesus is trying to honor the past, the origin story, the tradition, and the story, but also transcend into this moment? And he goes on with the transcendent part. The second is like it. You must love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and prophets, so he's literally referring to their texts, these texts that are so important to you, all of the law and the prophets, all of your heroes of past, all depend on these two commandments. Jesus is honoring the past and transcending into this moment. Now, there were some other teachers of the time, also in this day, that Jesus at times doesn't seem too fond of. And the reason he's not fond of them is because they have this ability to unpack the law and unpack the story and unpack the history. They still have this teaching ability in them, except they're using this ability to weaponize the story. They're using this ability to weaponize the law and exclude people and push people away. Now, the book of Matthew would not have been written originally with chapters and verses, right? It would have been just this long writing, this kind of like memoir that Matthew, one of the followers of Jesus, would have wrote down about Jesus. So if you were having this read to you in real time, back in the day, it wouldn't be, and then chapter 23 says this. There would have just been, we would just have it read to you in chunks. So in Matthew 22, Jesus is revealed as this good teacher, and with this context of honoring and transcending the moment. And then in Matthew 23, would have just been a couple chapters later, Matthew is telling stories of the kinds of teachers that Jesus came up against. So Matthew wants you to see the difference between Jesus, the good teacher, and teachers who were not so good. Now, I won't read all of Matthew 23. It's quite long and aggressive. But I will give you some of the words that Jesus is using for some of these teachers who are deciding they're going to weaponize the law. They're going to try to use the law in the story for their own benefit. He calls them hypocrites. He calls them blind guides, because they can't see what's happening right in front of them. He calls them children of snakes. This is a real first century dig here, okay? If you know the origin story, who was the snake in the book of Genesis? The devil, right? So he's calling them your children of the devil. I mean, this is strong, right? At one point, he refers to one of them as a child of hell, like you're coming from a really dark place, right? At one point, he refers to them as whitewashed tombs. You look good on the outside. You're good at talking. You're good orators. You sound like you're including the story, the past, the law, and helping us understand the future, but actually you are whitewashed tombs. What's a whitewashed tomb? Looks good on the outside, but is dead on the inside. I think you can begin to see the difference, right, between when a teacher in our midst is healthy and their heart is in a place of serving the body, these teachers can be so powerful and important for communities, even the church today, as we try to transcend into new realities without completely unhitching from our past. But also you can see, if you're a teacher in our midst, you've probably felt the desires even in you at different times to use your ability to analyze and tell stories and maybe narrate revisionist history to benefit yourself or keep people away that you might be uncomfortable with. I think we see this in the church. I wanted to give us maybe kind of two observations that I have in the church. So these are some observations as I've been walking with churches. And I think some of these observations you might resonate with, which is why I maybe share these today. That churches over time can tend to trend, one way or another. One way that churches sometimes trend is be really heavy in honoring apostles, prophets, and evangelists, and really light on kind of secluding or excluding voices that have more shepherding or teaching voices. This makes sense. Apostles and prophets exist on kind of the pioneering end of a movement or the pioneering end of an organization or a church. Apostles have incredible vision for the future and have a lot of energy to barrel in the future and take on risk. Prophets have this really keen understanding of the heart of God and can often come up against powers of the day in a way that feel and can be incredibly liberating for people who are under the hand of those oppressors. And so lots of organizations, movements start this way. And evangelists come along and they're just excited about anything that seems like good news to anybody else. Right? Have you heard this vision, man? What the things that church is doing, that organization is doing, that product that this business is starting, that restaurant just evangelists can get really excited about the good things in a vision and share and connect people to that could benefit from that. Evangelists in the same way can become incredible connectors for a prophetic movement, right? Have you heard about how we're sticking it to the man? Have you heard about the way we're standing up and speaking truth to that power that has had so much authority for so long over these people? And so you can see how these movements or these churches can grow. The problem is if we don't eventually include the shepherds and the teachers, what apostles and prophets are so willing to do is to dishonor the past just to move into the future. Apostles are happy to unhitch from the past in order to accomplish the vision in the future. Prophets are more than happy to unhitch from any past wisdom if it means we can take down that power right now at this time. And shepherds and teachers who help us to both honor the past and transcend the moment. Now, some churches trend the other way. I think this is probably more common in the West, is that some churches tend to decrease or dishonor apostles and prophets in our midst and trend towards evangelists and shepherds and teachers. That these churches can be really loving and caring at times. You think of a church that is led by shepherds in our midst, where shepherds have all kinds of room just to give everyone a hug and make sure everyone feels loved. Evangelists will really latch onto this and find all of their hurting friends and bring them all to the church and bring them all to these shepherds and say, these people are just giving out free hugs. Maybe not literal hugs, maybe literal hugs, but right? Or sometimes what happens in these midst is teachers end up having the most power in these churches. Almost always, teachers end up having the most power in these churches because shepherds aren't going to fight with the teachers. They don't like being the kinds of people who fight. They want to be lovers, not haters, right? And so teachers emerge who are really articulate, who can explain to everyone else how they ought to live, and then can pick up a book like an ancient text and break it apart in a way that you've never heard before, and it sounds so right and so true, and we're all in. But what happens in these churches over time is teachers will begin, the theology and the doctrine will get more and more exclusive over time, protecting the teachers themselves. See, teachers have this ability to keep interpreting the text or the community or the doctrine or the theology in a way that protects their motives and themselves and continues to exclude people who might challenge them in their ways of thinking. And so we're seeing this a lot in the church in the West right now, as churches and denominations are splitting and dividing because teachers have crossed every T and dotted every I to a point that really nobody can belong anymore. And so churches eventually shrivel and die without apostles and prophets speaking truth to power or helping the church move into new vision. So why talk about this on a day when we're talking to teachers? Well, I think it's actually healthy teachers in our midst that will help us not fall into either of these two traps. What churches that are heavy on the APE can dishonor the past and move into the future. The temptation of the church that's heavy on the EST is to honor the past, even hang on to the past, and fail to transcend the current moment. It's teachers in our midst that can help the entire body understand their role to play in all of this. See, apostles in our midst often end up leaving the church because it feels like to the apostles, this place can never change. But it's actually teachers in our midst that can help the apostles see and the community see that we must change to move into the future, that we must find new ways to be the church together as the society around us also shifts and changes. It's actually teachers in our midst that help prophets understand the great history in God's people of the prophetic tradition. I have met with so many people that have this prophetic energy inside of them and have never had anyone show them how deeply rooted the prophetic tradition is inside of God's people, that God's people have been speaking truth to power since before it was cool to speak truth to power. This has been so deep in the history, in the tradition of our scriptures and the church. And we need teachers in our midst to awaken the prophets to help them see how they live into this deeply rooted tradition of having a prophetic voice. We need teachers in our midst to help the evangelists see the ways in which they can communicate good news to people who primarily only hear bad news in their life. We need teachers in our midst to walk with shepherds and help them understand the ways in which they can best heal our community and guard against terribly exclusive theologies. It's the teachers in our midst that will continue to help show us all of the ways that all of us, no matter what our impulses are, can connect and live inside the story of God. That we also today live in a time when there are powers and principalities that have a heavy influence on our imagination on how we might live in the world today. That we're deeply influenced by the powers and principalities of today as well. And it's the teachers in our midst that can help us sort all of that out and understand what it might be to honor our past and transcend into today. There's this deep YouTube cut. You may or may not have seen. You probably haven't. It's like deep in the YouTubes, right? It's Jerry Seinfeld. Everyone know Jerry Seinfeld? Okay. Yeah, there's a couple Gen Zers here like, who? Jerry Seinfeld, very famous comedian, and there's a video of him on YouTube where he was just at like a comedy club, a small comedy club in some city somewhere, and there's this comedian on stage. He's probably about my age, like young, like mid late 30s, and he's like really working hard and at his craft, and he notices Jerry in the crowd. I mean, can you imagine? Right? And after he finishes his bit, he tracks down Jerry Seinfeld and has a conversation with him. And someone had the whereabouts to get out their phone and record the conversation. So it's a really bad recording. And he's asking Seinfeld, he's saying how long do I do this for? And Jerry's like, well, what do you mean? Well, how long do I keep working at this and working at this? He's like, well, do you love it? He's like, yeah, I absolutely love it. Do you feel purpose in it? Yeah, absolutely. This is what I feel like I'm made to do, but how long do I keep trying? Jerry's like, what do you mean? He's like, well, all of my friends, they're starting to build their families. And they're starting to have these careers and they're climbing the corporate ladder. All of my friends are saving money for their retirements. All of my friends are living into this dream, this American dream that we've been, that we're supposed to live into. I'm mid to late 30s and I'm still cutting my teeth in these small comedy clubs. And Jerry kind of thinks for a minute and he says, I'm going to tell you a story. He tells him this story about this orchestra, this really famous orchestra, and people who have worked their craft and worked their craft and worked their craft. And this orchestra is on their way to a really important concert, and they're flying in an airplane, and it's snowing out. It's wintertime. And the pilot is on the speaker saying, like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to land. I can't see the runway anywhere. And the orchestra is like, please find a way to land, right? You know, these good orchestras, like the show must go on, true artists. And so the pilot finds a field that he can land in, and he lands in the field, this pilot. And the orchestra is sitting on the plane and like, well, what are we going to do? And someone speaks up and says, well, we've got to get to the show. And so here are all of these members of the orchestra in their suits and their black attire, and they got their long coats on. They got their dress shoes on, their high heels, and they're gathering up their instruments, and they're trekking across this snowy field, trying to get to the location of their concert. And they walk into this neighborhood, and they walk through this neighborhood, and they look inside, and there's this family in this house, big bay window, and they're sitting in their living room, and this family, they're sitting around this fire, and they're warm, and I think, you know, one of the parents like reading a book, and you just like imagine they're all like cozied up in this fire. And one member of the orchestra looks to the other member of the orchestra and goes, can you believe people live like this? Like shining a light on this idea of like, we get to make music. We get to do what we love to do and honor our craft, and night after night after night share this beautiful thing that we create together with the world. Meanwhile, these people in there, they're just sitting around on a Friday night in the warmth of their house. They're missing out, right? And I think for a lot of us, maybe not a lot of us, maybe it's just some of us, but we feel this, don't we? There's this pressure of the American dream to check all the boxes, to do all the things, and make sure that I'm going to work hard my whole life and get to 65 and retire. Can I just tell you, as a pastor, like I've had so many conversations with people crossing the line of retirement. They have all the money they need to coast out the rest of their life. 20, 25, maybe 30 years of just coasting. There's a real emptiness to that. I've sat with so many of my peers who are in a season when the most important thing in their life might be spending time with their family or their kids or even some of their close friends. But there's this immense pressure to work and to work and to work to save so we can get across that line of 65 when all of our friends are gone and our kids are gone and our life has moved on, just so we can coast out the last 25, 30 years of our life. And I think sometimes when we become awakened to the kingdom of God, we can move through life with people in such a way where the person to your left and the person to your right is coming alive to the things that God has called and created them to do. And we can look out to the world and be like, can you believe that people live like this? That they give up on having meaning and purpose, living into their theogenetics for the rest of their life in everything they do. That people miss out on this because they're under some other power and principality. Maybe it's not Rome and maybe it's not slavery, but the powers and principalities are the same. That they teach us to live into a narrative or a story that supports the system and the way the system has been built. But Jesus is inviting us into a different story. And it's the teachers in our midst to have this immense power to devise that story and help everyone in our community understand the ways that you have been called and created by God to live into this story that is thousands and thousands of years old, that is good news to the world. Maybe it's not the American dream for you. Maybe it's a family pressure. Maybe there's a way that your family has always lived and grown up, and so you've got pressure to raise your kids the same way, live the same way. It's still a power and principality. Maybe you're getting really caught up in the political divisiveness of our culture right now. That it actually benefits the powers of the world, the powers of America, if we can turn against each other rather than listen to each other and care for each other. Jesus invites us into a different story, and that story is not the American dream, it's not your family history, and it's not political divisiveness. It invites us into a deep story that helps us to understand our theogenetics, the ways in which we are called and created to live in this world. We need teachers in our midst to help us deeply wrestle with this incredible invitation of Jesus to become fully mature in the world. We also live in a time right now as a church where we have to think about our ethics and our morality and what it looks like to live in this world. And some teachers that are unhealthy want to just hold on to the past as tightly as possible, no matter what it means for the future of the church. Some teachers in unhealth just want to run forward into the future and completely unhitch from the past. But healthy teachers in our midst will help us understand the story, how we got to where we got to today, and listen to our community and listen to the world we're into today and transcend into a new reality. Teachers, you have this incredible place in our community and in our church to do this today. So I want to just give this call to teachers in our midst. If this resonates inside of you, if you're like, man, I'm the kind of person who can understand these complex ideas, that can narrate a story and help see the ways it connects today. I'm really passionate about understanding how our scriptures work and how things are said and the way they are said and the time they were said to help us understand how we can be a people in this time, in this place, in this way. If that deeply resonates with you, here's my advice for you. Wrestle deeply with Jesus' teachings, his motives, and his methods. It's actually through these teachings of Jesus, the motives of Jesus, the methods of Jesus, the rest of the scriptures can be opened up to us. And it'll help us understand as a local church in this place at this time with this people, how we might live and honor those teachings today. When you think about the people that God has placed in your orbit, you have this incredible power, if you can listen to them, to help illuminate a path for those in your orbit of how God might be inviting them to live into the story of God. We need you, teachers, to help us wrestle in this new day with really important questions of ethics and morality. We need your help to wrestle with what it means for the church and our church to continue to adapt and live into a world that we've never seen before, and to do all of that without forsaking the person and teachings of Jesus. One of the challenges of being a teacher in a church like this, having these impulses in a church like this, is me. I'm one of the challenges, because I do this thing on Sunday that we call teaching, a skill that I've been working on for decades. This is an expression of teaching, but there are a lot of ways for people to be teachers and live out that embodiment in our midst. And so I wanted to invite a few teachers in our community to come and share maybe how that looks for them. So Cheryl and Joel and Kiki, you want to come join us? Can we give them a round of applause? I know. You tricked me today. I was looking for you. So I've had the opportunity to get to know all three of you and witness the ways in which your kind of teaching impulses come out in your life, both in our church and in your life. Cheryl, I want to start with you because I think when you and I first started talking about this, you were maybe a little apprehensive. When you first kind of heard this title teacher, I think you filled out that inventory, that quiz that we're passing around. What were your kind of first responses to that?
Well, I thought I would be more like a shepherd because I was always taking care of people. But I guess once I started looking back, I realized not only was I taking care of people, but I had 4 siblings that I taught lots of things to. I did home daycare for 20 years, which I not only took care of them, but I also did a preschool program so that they could learn. I started a Sunday school at a previous church, and now I'm involved deeply with our women's Bible study.
And that women's Bible study, this is one of the coolest things at Westwinds. It's been around, you told me last service, for like about 15 years?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's passed on to like different leaders have led this over the time. I've also met so many women in our community that at different seasons of their life have interacted with this Bible study, and it's been a huge blessing in their life. Why do you think, one, it's like sustained so long and that women are finding value in their life to kind of keep engaging in the learning?
Well, first of all, it forms a sense of community in our church. It also helps us to dig deeper into the Bible and learn more. We've gone from different studies of the books of the Bible, women of the Bible. Right now we're doing how your emotions affect yourselves. And so it's called Untangle Your Emotions, and it shows us how Jesus used his emotions. And so it's okay to be mad, or it's okay to be angry. And so I think it's just created a great community for the women at Westwinds.
Amazing. Kiki, you don't normally like hanging out with the tall people.
No.
Kiki she's our children's director here at Westwinds, and has just done incredible work helping kind of get that moving. And just as a parent, I'm so thankful for the work that you are doing, often on the other side of the building, but in the lives of my own kids. But you and I have had a lot of conversations about the way in which we teach kids that I think is actually really profound for adults. So you can just kind of pretend they're all not here right now. But I'd love to hear about some of the ways in which you're thinking about teaching children and the way they learn.
Yeah, so I wanted to come at this in a new way. I grew up in church. I've heard the same Bible stories taught the same ways for decades. And I wanted to come at it from a curiosity approach. I want kids to be able to ask questions, but I also was we've been teaching stories the same way for such a long time. Like, it's one story, and this is the meaning of it. And that's not how it always is. Last week we taught Paul and Silas, and growing up, the message we got from hearing Paul and Silas were in prison. They were praising Jesus. You should praise Jesus if you go to prison too. Or you should always have this ability to be happy as a Christian. And that's just not how it is. I'm sorry, Ivy is being so cute. I'd clearly rather be with the kids right now. And that's just not how it is. Paul and Silas, yes, praise Jesus in prison, but the story is not necessarily about Paul and Silas. The story is about what God is doing in their lives. And the story is about how the church is open to everyone, whether it was the slave girl they freed, which got them in prison, whether it was to the other fellow prisoners, or whether it was to the jailer. Jesus was making a way for everyone to come to him. And it wasn't just about Paul and Silas. They're not the heroes of the story. Jesus is the hero of the story. God is the hero of the story. The work the Holy Spirit was doing is the hero of the story. The church, in its new look, in its new way after Jesus' death and resurrection, that's the hero of the story. Yeah. And so I think just changing the mind shift from how do these stories that we've heard for years, where we've made the characters, the people, the heroes, how do we turn them from being the people are the heroes to God being the hero again?
And one of the things that I love about that, I mean, my family came to faith later in life, and I was like at that kind of elementary age when we started going to church, and it was like, here's the story, and then here's the moral lesson we're going to shove right down through the middle of the story.
Right.
And what that created in a lot of us that grew up in that tradition was then we began to read the Bible just looking for moral wisdom, right? Like, okay, I'm going to read the story and find the one, I'm going to try to build a morality, and that's kind of how people start getting excluded.
What to do and what not to do, and how to behave and what not to do.
Right.
If you're a good Christian, you do these things.
And you don't do these things.
If you don't do these things, you're not a good Christian, or maybe you're not a Christian at all.
Right, but you're using curiosity as a way to help invite kids into the story and help them get to know Jesus and this God who will be with them for the rest of their lives.
For the rest of their lives.
It's beautiful. I love it. Thank you. And then Joel, I've been joking, Joel is the greatest among us. So we've been doing these like inventories, these quizzes. Over 100 people in our church have filled out an inventory to learn more about maybe some of their own impulses. And so Joel scored the highest on teacher than anyone else in our church. And it wasn't even close. He scored higher on teacher than anyone else scored on anything in our church. And those of us who know Joel, and I've gotten to know Joel a little bit over the last couple years, are like, well, of course he did. If you've ever watched Joel talk to his kids, he will kneel down and explain everything to them in great detail. If you are friends with Joel, he's probably invited you to a game night where you're going to play the most complex, detailed game you've ever imagined. And he will happily explain every detail to you as many times as you like. Joel is teaching me how to play pickleball right now. So Joel just like exudes this, like, I want to teach people to do things. So I thought, Joel, it'd be interesting to chat with you a little bit about what this feels like inside of you, to have such strong teaching impulses. What kind of inner dialogue happens inside of you with when that is in you?
I get real excited to make something clear to you, to meet you where you are, to understand what you grasp, and then share something new with you, to make it something that you can engage in, something that you can feel mastery over, something that you can take forward with you into the rest of your life.
Where have you seen, and I think you're a good person to speak to this too because it's so strong in you, like what are some areas that maybe you've had to mature in, or is there like a shadow side to this? You know, sometimes our greatest strengths are our greatest weaknesses, blah, 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 blah. How does that play out in your life?
I have to be very, very careful, incredibly intentional about listening well. It is very easy for me to slip into, I've learned the thing, I know the thing well, help me help you. Allow me to shape you into what will be good for you, because I want good for you. It's coming from a place of, I want you to succeed. But I have to be so careful that I'm listening to you, that I'm listening to the context, that I'm not just trying to shape you into me, but that I'm trying to give you what is true that you can take forward and apply to how you do life.
That's good. When like in the first century, like when Jesus and these rabbis were emerging, what was so unique about the rabbis is that they did know the law, they did know the story, but unlike teachers of the law or scribes of the time, their methods was not to like impose things on people, but rabbis were known for being so good at facilitating learning within the community. And so they get people talking to each other, they even get people arguing with each other, and then they'd share some parable or story that would draw more wisdom out of the community. And so rabbis were these incredible listeners, teachers that loved and supported the community and helped it kind of move forward together, even amidst their difference. And I hear that in all of you, right? That you're facilitating learning among this women's Bible study. There's a lot of conversation that happens in life. You're facilitating learning through curiosity with children, and you're facilitating learning among your own children and your friends, and within our community as well. I'd love to hear, and this will be my last question, but I'd like for each of you to maybe to answer it, like, what do you long for most when you think about our church and our community? Joel, why don't you start us off? What do you long for most when you think about Westwinds, this church, this place where your family's a part of this thing?
Connection. I want to be connected to you, to hear from you, to learn from you too. I want to be a person that listens well and engages in life with you. I want you to be able to ask me, Joel, where are you failing today? And for me to be able to trust you and share, this is a place that I'm bad at life. And so not just teaching, but learning from you as well.
How about you, Kiki?
For me, at least in the kids' rooms, I mean, I do love all of you too.
Kind of.
Only because you bring me your children.
That's good.
No, in the kids' room, there are the 3 C's that we operate with in the kids' classrooms, and that's curiosity, community, and centered. If those 3 things are happening, if we are creating community, if we are centering our story around God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, or the church, if we are giving them time and opportunity to be curious, then we're doing our job.
Yeah.
Like, that's what I deeply want for those kids.
Yeah, that's good. How about you, Cheryl?
I'm going to go with the community, sharing our faith with each other, learning from each other. Even in our Bible study class, like I'm going to be 70 and I'm still learning.
No, you're not.
Yes, I am. What? I'm still learning things. You know, we've learned things. We did a study on the Holy Spirit, and there were things in there we're all going, I didn't know that. You know, and we've been a Christian forever, you know, it seems like. So the community, the sharing, spreading the love.
Yeah, that's great. Well, can we thank our panel today very much? I'm going to invite the band to come up, and this is how we want to close our gathering today. We want to finish around the table. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he gave the church, his body, his community, perhaps the most unifying practice that has sustained the church throughout history, and that's this practice of taking communion together. And we wanted to share in this in a specific way the last 2 weeks. Shepherds and teachers actually are from the same cloth. They both long for this connection, this unity. We heard it in the panel today. Shepherds will do it by helping people feel loved and cared for and healed and listened to. Teachers will do it by helping people understand their place in the community and the story of God, but it's the same impetus, the same impulse. And so the way we want to do this today is we want to invite, if you feel this teaching impulse in you, it's like, as we've been talking about this week, or maybe you scored high T on the inventory we took, or as I'm sharing today, you're like resonating with like, I think I might have this in me. We want to invite you to come to the table first with our teaching panel and to take communion with other teachers in our midst. And then you're going to turn around with a cup and a plate and come out and share communion with the rest of our community. This reminder that the best place for all of us, and today especially teachers, is serving our body and serving our community and laying our life down for one another. And so I know this might be a really courageous moment for a few of you, so the best thing to do is just to like move quick, okay? And so I'm gonna step off this stage, and as I step down, if you'll step up, these three would love to serve you communion and then send you into our body to share as well. So teachers, would you come now and receive the elements?